inaugural Joseph S. Nye Jr. Class of '58 Lecture in International Affairs, and we're very pleased to have Joseph Nye here with us this afternoon. Before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you a little bit about him, and I know that our speaker will say a little bit more, but he is among Princeton's most distinguished alumni. In 2003, he was given the Woodrow Wilson Award. For those of you who aren't local, you may not know that much about it, but it's the highest award that is given by the university to an undergraduate alumnus or alumna of the university. His training after he graduated from Princeton was at Oxford and Harvard. He's somebody who, like many of our best graduates, are the ones we're most proud of. He has a career that's combined government service as well as academics. In terms of government service, he was chair of National Security Group on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. He was chair of the National Intelligence Council and Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Again, he also has a very distinguished academic career that has paralleled this career in government service. He was Dean of the Kennedy School, and he continues at Harvard as a distinguished service professor. He's probably best known for, or maybe not best known, but his earliest very influential work was a 1977 book that he wrote with our very own Bob Keohane on power and interdependence, world politics, and transition. And this book was pivotal because it really established the neoliberal school of thought in international relations, which has been very important in the discipline. More recently, Nye has pioneered the theory of soft power in international affairs. Now, I'm giving you this background by way of an advertisement, which is that we're fortunate that he will be returning to Princeton again, February 21st to 23rd, where he will be giving the Richard Ullman Lectures. So those of you who want to hear directly from Professor Nye can come and hear him there. Now, when we were trying to figure out who to invite to give this inaugural lecture, it was actually really easy because Anne-Marie Slaughter was the logical person to take on this task. As most of you know, Anne-Marie is the Bert G. Kerstetter 66 University Professor of Politics and International Affairs, and like Professor Nye, she has combined a career of government service as well as academic work. She just spent 2 years, came back in 2011 as Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. Department of State. She's been at Princeton for some time after leaving Harvard. She came here as Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and we're delighted to have her back on the faculty. She's written or edited 6 books and numerous articles. A New World Order was published in 2004. It promoted the importance of networks in international relations. And more recently, she wrote a book, The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World. So I'm very pleased to have her here today and to give this inaugural lecture. And her talk is on the faces of power. And now I get to turn around and see if... Not. Okay. So we now have every academic's worst nightmare, which is giving a talk without your slides. I see a light coming on, and so it's magic. It's coming on. I'm going to let Anne-Marie start, and then the slides will catch up with her, I'm sure. So please join me in welcoming her.
This is a bit like an anxiety dream, I have to tell you. But we're going to proceed and... Aha, just in time. That would be the Dreaming Spires of Oxford. We are one step ahead of myself, but on we go. So first of all, it's great to be here, and this is a particular pleasure, a personal pleasure, as well as an honor. Everybody's going to look up there to see if it gets going. Let me start by saying the reason you are looking at the Dreaming Spires of Oxford is that is really when I first encountered Joe Nye in person. He didn't encounter me. I was just one of the adoring students who listened rapt to his every word at Pembroke College. He was returning, he had been a Rhodes Scholar, he'd been in Pembroke, he was giving a lecture, and I still can recall this sort of crisp fall night and listening to him talk and feeling like there was no question that he didn't know the answer to, and vowing then and there that when I got back to Harvard, because I knew I was going to Harvard Law School, I would march down and ask him if I could teach for him, and that's exactly what I did. I then did teach for him for 2 years when he taught the course A12, which is the equivalent of our Politics 240, and my husband-to-be, though I didn't know it then, was TAing for him, so it's all very much in the family. After I taught at Harvard when Joe was, first of all, was the head of the Center for International Affairs, now the Weatherhead Center. Then he was dean of the Kennedy School. I actually taught for a year when he was dean. I asked him for advice about deaning, as I asked him for advice later about going to Washington. Indeed, he has been a mentor in just about everything I've done. When I came here as dean, he was the expert witness in the Robertson suit. This lecture may be the only good thing that has come out of that particular experience. Out of that, he endowed this lecture, and it's particularly wonderful to be able to give it. But I actually met Joe Nye in another way, well before we went to Oxford. I met him in this room, this very room, where I was sitting where you are, as a sophomore, in Politics 240, in 1977, or fall of 1977. What was assigned was power and interdependence. Now, you just heard that it was just written. I didn't know that. I thought it was gospel. It was presented to me by my professor as a way of thinking about the world. And I still remember vividly reading it. I still have that copy marked up in my study. And so by the time I met him at Oxford, I had already met him intellectually, and he and Bob Cohan began a trajectory that very much has been carried through Joe's work, as I will discuss today. So let us see if we can actually get to the next slide. Yes. It was not hard to figure out what to name this lecture. Joseph Nye is very interested in power. These are the titles of his last 6 books: The Paradox of American Power, Power in the Global Information Age, Soft Power, The Power Game, that's a novel, it's a very good novel, The Powers to Lead, and most recently, The Future of Power. So it wasn't hard to figure out what I wanted to talk about in this inaugural lecture. Indeed, so just to keep this really all in the family, John Eikenberry, in reviewing the future of power, wrote, "Nye is the preeminent theorist of power in the world today." Now, as a student of foreign affairs, as a public servant, it's not surprised that Joseph Nye is interested in power and leadership. But what he has done for us in the study of power is really to complicate it, to look at it from multiple different dimensions: hard power, soft power, smart power, and as we're going to hear today, looking at the different ways it can be exercised. In his current book, he starts with 2 different definitions of power. The first is a definition that is often used, the resources, that we look at states, the United States, Soviet Union, used to be, China today, and we look at them in terms of their resources, their population, the size of their territory, how many natural resources they have, their economic strength, and their social stability. That gives rise to some very formal accounts of power, like this one: the composite index of national capability. You have a ratio, the country relative to the world, and the composite index of that country's power is the total population, the urban population, the iron and steel production, the primary energy consumption ratio, the military expenditure ratio, and the military personnel ratio, all added up together and divided by 6. I hope that gives you the idea. That is not the best way to actually evaluate power, but Joe notes that this is a frequent way. Indeed, this is borrowed from a data set that was developed by David Singer at Michigan. There's another definition of power, one that Joe himself uses and I think is much more congenial automatically to all of us. Power defined as behavioral outcomes, the capacity to do things and in social situations to affect others to get the outcomes that we want. So I have a very good equation to figure that out. It is more complicated, which is exactly why we need theorists like Joe to talk about it. But he then breaks that down into the three faces of relational power. Relational power being the ability to get somebody to do, or somebody or something, some institution, to do what it is you want. And indeed, I was struck reading his book. I chose the title of the lecture before I'd gotten to that part of the book, but it was particularly apposite. So the first face of relational power is commanding change. And you can make somebody do something they don't want to do. They prefer to do one thing, you want them to do another, you can make them do that. You can make them do that with force, you can make them do that with economic power, you can make them do that with discipline of some kind. I was struck as I was reading this, I was remembering that Thomas Schelling in his great book, The Strategy of Conflict, is supposed to have drawn most of his examples from parenting. In our household, when we want our children to do things, they do it absolutely immediately and with no question. So I'm very familiar with commanding change. The second face of relational power, and here again already this concept of power is broader than command, is controlling agendas. Right? You can get people to do things that you want them to do by giving them a limited set of choices. This is the first lesson we teach our students in 501. Any bureaucrat gives you one very unattractive option and another very unattractive option. You can go to war, you can capitulate, or you can follow my strategy. You know, Tom, as a government official, nods very vigorously. So controlling agendas. Again, this is, you can do this in multiple ways. You can use ideas. Often when you think about non-governmental organizations, they use frames to set an agenda. If you think of human rights campaigns, the most recent one around female circumcision, they reframed that as female genital mutilation. That was a way of changing the entire frame so that the choices look very different. In our household, that is, do you want to go to art camp or theater camp? That is known as structuring your children's summer vacation. Any other options are off the table. All right, so the third way, the third face of power, commanding change, setting agendas, is shaping preferences. So you shape what the object that you're trying to exercise power over wants in the first place. Here, Joe has a wonderful quote from Dwight Eisenhower who says, you know, you can get people to do what you want them to do out of respect for you, out of wanting instinctively to do what you want. So it's a much deeper process. And here we use ideas, we use beliefs, culture, very important, to shape the underlying beliefs and perceptions and preferences so that honestly people in this context often don't know that power is being exercised. They think this is something they want, they don't think about where that want comes from. A very good example here at Princeton, the honor code. How do we move that up? Well, I'll read it. So to any Princeton student here, at least an undergraduate, I pledge my honor that I have not violated the honor code during this examination, and you sign your name. The whole notion of an honor code, the whole notion of signing a pledge every time you take an examination is creating a culture in which your word means something, and the idea of being on your honor means something, and it shapes the way you then think about your relations with others, with indeed, I've had Princeton graduates tell me that in their business dealings with other Princeton graduates, the very fact that they came out of that same normative culture shapes what they think how they can trust others, and what they want. All right, so we have these three faces of power Again, power defined as getting others to do what you want them to do, being able to influence them. You can do that through command. You can do that through constraining them, through agenda setting, and you can do that through shaping their deep preferences through ideas and beliefs and culture. Now, I now want to argue that although I think this is a very elegant and apposite and useful definition of power, an explication of power, it is really most apposite to state power. It describes the ways that states are composed of states. Now, at this point, Bob Cohan just leaned forward and started writing down. What? What? Didn't I just mention power and interdependence? Didn't power and interdependence actually describe a world that wasn't just about states? It was a world that actually included states, but also non-state actors. It is not all about states. That would be a realist view for the 501 members of this audience. Power and Interdependence. That is not my well-marked up copy. That is the third edition. I had the first edition. I have to say it's improved in its color and liveliness over time, for those of us who remember the avocado green and rust brown first issue. So in Power and Interdependence, both Bob and Joe described two quite different worlds. And remember, this is 1977. I'm just going to say right up front, since I taught this last Thursday, and some of you were in that lecture, it is very humbling for me to read it and realize that in some version or other, I've been writing the same thing for the last 20 years, and not just me. Many, many people are still making this observation because we are at a time in our history where we are shifting from, when I say we are shifting over 10, 20, 50 to 100 years, shifting from a world in which states had most of the power to a world in which social actors also have power. But so the two worlds they describe, realism, we know pretty well, states are coherent units and are the predominant actors in world politics. Force is a usable and effective instrument of policy. This is very important. And still an assumption in much of our foreign policy and much of our international relations. We obviously don't want to use force, but we assume that it is usable and it's effective. And that there's a hierarchy of issues in world politics. That high politics, the politics of guns and bombs, are much more important than low politics, the politics of economics or of social and cultural activity. Complex interdependence, on the other hand, says there are multiple channels that connect societies. It is not just the foreign minister talking to the foreign minister or the head of state talking to the head of state. There are many different parts of government that interact with each other. The justice ministries, the health ministries, obviously the various militaries, the energy ministries, lots of different parts of government talk to each other, and lots of social actors who are not in government connect each other. So many, many different channels that actually connects the societies. And that the agenda between these states is not just about guns and bombs. Indeed, there isn't even there's no clear hierarchy, and there are lots of different issues. So with the Europeans, we can talk about trade, we can talk about agriculture, we can talk about antitrust, we can talk about environmental issues, the same with the Japanese. With many states, the international agenda looks very much like the domestic agenda. And finally, and critically, military force is not used by governments toward other governments, either within a region or on a particular issue in conditions of complex interdependence. So there's a whole part of the world where they say, force just isn't really on the table. And again, if you think of our relations with Japan or the European Union or Canada for that matter, or many other states, force is really not something that is realistic. We don't think about it. There was, after the Cold War ended, Milton Friedman did predict that France and Germany might go to war, and I suppose if the euro really destroys itself and everything goes bust in the EU, we could think about that. But by and large, that's an accurate description of those area of relations. In addition, Can you see that? Joe has taken this one step further and talked about three-dimensional chess. And the beauty of the internet is you can find a picture of anything. This is a three-dimensional chessboard, where, as Joe says, actually the way to think about the world we're in is there are three different levels of interaction. If you think of international relations as a game of a strategic game, and the top level up there is the military level, and the middle level is the economic level, and the bottom level is the social level. And there's different ways to think about power on all three. So the top level, military, the United States is still absolutely dominant. At the second level, economic, no, there are many. The EU actually has a bigger GDP than we do. It's a bigger aggregate economy, and obviously Japan, China now rising, but even Germany itself, there are many powerful economic actors. And then on the bottom level with social actors, well, hard to know, constantly changing. Al-Qaeda had tremendous power at the beginning of this decade, much less now, but you have drug cartels and you have social movements. Hard even to think about state power in that context. And I did discover something else when I was trolling the internet for a three-dimensional chessboard, and it gave me a different take on the way that Professor Nye thinks about power. It appears that in fact Mr. Spock was a great fan of three-dimensional chess, so we may actually need to add this theory of intergalactic power. That is not good. Okay. But what I still want to argue, having, I hope, given full due to the way in which I think power and interdependence fairly described a large part of the world, and recognized, as is true, that in another part of the world, our relations with North Korea, our relations with Iran, in some ways our relations with China, that in some parts of the world actually are accurately captured by this realist picture, and others are accurately captured by this much more complex picture. I think that's true, but I will still argue that it doesn't actually take account of the world we're now in and of ways of thinking about power that are very different. And in the remaining time that we have before discussion, I want to give you a different view of what that world looks like and how to think about power within it. Power from the bottom up. Again, states are important in this world, but we're really thinking now about power among social actors. All of you organized into different groups. Those of you who are in corporations thinking about how corporations interact, on the assumption that none of you are in criminal cartels. I won't extend the metaphor, but criminal cartels as well. Okay, so the first thing to know about power in this world, and it's a world in which individuals are increasingly empowered by their ability to exercise the communications and computing power that once only states could. In this world, the first thing that happens in an audience like this is that the speaker and the audience, that's not you, I thought about how to get a picture of you and gave it up, that is me, the speaker and the audience merge. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. So if we were in the kind of conferences I've been going to, where I am probably 20 years older than just about anybody there, we would have this kind of conference. I'd be up here talking, and you'd be down there listening, not down there, but there, listening. And we're very familiar with that. But at the same time, there would be another interaction going on that would be simultaneous and every bit as much of the event. Behind me, there would be a Twitter feed, and it would have the comments of all of you who chose to take notes on a computer or on your BlackBerry, saying what you thought I said was interesting. So you would have probably just tweeted, Nye and Cohan, Power and Interdependence. Slaughter says, only describes top-down world. And then somebody else, maybe that's somebody from this side of the audience, so somebody over there says, no, actually that's all wrong. This would be going on behind me as I'm talking. And somebody else would then, still sort of taking notes on what's going on, would respond to what this other person said. So at the same time that you're all listening to me, you would be talking to each other via the ability to be electronically linked and to have a common platform. Indeed, and I've seen this happen, if I said something wrong, perhaps I misstated a fact or an assertion, somebody in the audience would immediately check it, would then announce that it was wrong. Other people would note that. If you're particularly adroit as a speaker, you should be paying attention to that and actually interacting. But the point there is that, as I said, this experience of my being the speaker and your being the audience, that merges because you are actually all participating yourselves in a common conversation that is sparked by mine. Okay, so let me give you a version of that. That was my version from my experience, having now participated in these conferences. But I want to give you a slightly more analytical account of what happens. And this is from Mika Sifri, who actually also happens to be a Princeton alum. I think he's class of 1983. And somebody could probably check it instantly. He's whichever one he is. And he is a analyst, he's a journalist, and an analyst of what he would call open source politics. And he's recently written this book, WikiLeaks and the Age of Transparency. And since I'm now out of the State Department, I can actually put a slide with WikiLeaks on it up. I'm not going to say anything more about WikiLeaks, however. So he describes this experience that I just talked to you about as being disconcerting and exhilarating. He says in 2004, he goes to a conference, and the conference is actually, it's a conference that is a kind of teach-in. And he said, on stage is Joe Trippi, who's at that point Howard Dean's campaign manager, who was being interviewed by a veteran journalist. And he says, so he's there and he's listening to this interview. And then he notices that halfway down the stage, there's something that was called a chat bot. Now you just use Twitter, but this was a sort of chat room that was enabled. And he realizes, as I just described, that about half the audience had their laptops open and they were actively commenting on the conversation that was going on screen. And he then realized how it is that the internet can actually give more people a voice in what used to be a closed conversation. Because he says, actually, half the people in the room knew as much or more as the people who were speaking. At this point, this gets very frightening for those of us who claim authority to stand up in front of you. You've got everybody there able to say, no, that's not right, or here's another insight. He then says, by seeing all these comments, he could participate. So instead of feeling like he was just a member of the audience, he then felt like, no, I'm an equal part of the conversation. Even more importantly, he says, I didn't need to be credentialed. I didn't need to be up there as the campaign manager or the scholar or the expert. What mattered was the content of what I said, because this was a pretty expert audience, and people judge what you say based on how much sense it makes, or whether or not it contributes something to the conversation. So finally he says, I was now a full-fledged member of the group that NYU scholar Jay Rosen has dubbed the people formerly known as the audience. That's what I meant when I said the speaker and the audience merge. At these conferences, and they are happening more and more often, they're definitely a mental workout, there isn't this relationship of the power of the speaker to the audience is really upended. It is a general conversation. The speaker launches it, but definitely doesn't control where it necessarily goes. All right, so I want to talk about what that means then in that world where people are empowered as much as the authority figure to take part, to take action, to be their own agents. And I want to try to talk then about how we would think about the faces of power in that relationship. Okay, so let's talk about power from the bottom up. So first of all, it is about unlocking the power of individuals and groups. And I just gave you an example in the context of where we are now to be part of a conversation. But you can see these examples everywhere. Indeed, as I was thinking about this lecture, for any of you who read Thomas Friedman's column yesterday, it was exactly on this point. So one big example is from USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which of course gives the lion's share of U.S. Civilian foreign assistance. So we have USAID still, but increasingly now we have Kiva and many things like it. So for those of you who don't know, Kiva, which was created by several terrific young people, is a website where you can go on and you can find a project that you want to contribute to. There are ways to evaluate that project, and you can donate. It is this, and indeed our own alum Dennis Whittle has a very similar website called Global Giving, effectively finding projects in developing countries and then making it possible for anybody to support them without conditions, without any kind of government imprimatur. From NDI, National Democratic Election Monitoring, to Ushahidi. So election monitoring we do as a government, or really through quasi-governmental institutions, the National Democratic Institute and the National Republican Institute, and we still do that. But Ushahidi was developed by Kenyans in the most recent Kenyan election, where there, if you will recall, there was a lot of election violence and a lot of fraud. So 4 Kenyans, very technologically both sophisticated and entrepreneurial, put together a platform that allowed them to get information from anyone with a cell phone, and then to aggregate it and map it according to polling sites. So it's a technology that is now being used in over 20,000 citizen applications, because anytime you can't get information from traditional sources, or you don't trust information from traditional sources, you can get it from people who are on site, you can aggregate it, and you can map it. It was used with Hurricane Katrina here. It was used in Haiti during the earthquake. The State Department, indeed the office that I was in, helped get the Ushahidi platform and to customize it for the Haitian situation. So of course we'll still have election monitoring, but now you can do it on your own with actual participants in the election. Or from the Special Envoy for Gaza Disengagement, that would be Jim Wolfenson, who was appointed by the Quartet, the US, the European Union, the UN, and Russia. He was supposed to be the official embassy of the international community to disengage as the Israelis pulled out of Gaza and to reconstruct Gaza. Hasn't worked exactly as planned, and there are obviously many obstacles. But in the meantime, and much more recently, there is the Palestinian Political Risk Insurance Project, created initially by the Center for American Progress, with several investment firms and a couple of NGOs, one US and one Palestinian, on the premise that Palestinian exporters have very unstable business conditions. That's obviously very difficult if you're planning investments. They are much more likely to be able to actually invest and to grow if they have political risk insurance. There's not a huge market. Lloyd's of London is not beating down their door to offer that kind of political risk insurance. So an NGO, a think tank, a couple of private firms organized to do it. I could give you hundreds and thousands of examples, and indeed you can find them pretty much anytime, anything you read increasingly, and the government increasingly thinks this is the way we're going to have to do more and more foreign policy, precisely because the government is more constrained, has fewer resources, but also because this allows you to tap the energy, the entrepreneurship, the creativity, the innovation of social actors. So unlocking the power of individuals and groups. Second, this is power in the world of social media, the cloud, and universal mobile devices. So in social media and more broadly, media companies and information companies, you have Google, you have Apple, Facebook, Amazon. Those are the generally regarded, or at least Eric Schmidt regards them as the four horsemen of the internet. They are fundamentally changing the ways we interact. We interact with each other, but also, of course, the way we interact with books or music. As I told Joe Nye the last night, I, of course, pulled down his book on my iPad instantly through Apple. I could have done it equally well through Amazon on my Kindle. And, of course, I wouldn't have found most of these images if it were not for Google. I don't use Facebook, but it's equally important as a way for many people to interact. But also, of course, the prevalence of mobile devices. So that you've got countries now where, even in Africa, you have 40 to 60% and growing constantly. There are some countries where you have 120% penetration because of SIM cards, where people in the remotest villages have the ability to communicate through mobile devices. So, unlocking the power of individuals and groups, using mobile technology and the computing power of the cloud and social media. The third dimension of power from the bottom up is it's much more horizontal power, moving from vertical to horizontal. So the images you're looking at, one is a ladder. That is one way of thinking about power. You get to the top, and not surprisingly, from that point of view, you can command, you can constrain, you can shape preferences. The other view of power is a web. You're at the center of that web. You also have tremendous power. You are more connected than anyone else in the web. And that, the ability to be connected, or the degree to which you are connected, allows you to connect others and to mobilize them and to catalyze activity. It is a complementary view of power. None of these are, one world is all this way and another's all the other, but it's a different view of power. And I would suggest that the initial view, when I was talking about the way in which Joe Nye talks about power, it's still more vertical than horizontal. And finally, this is about mobilizing a problem-solving process. In the discussion of state power, we typically assume we know the outcome we want. When I said, I can change your preferences, I can make you do something you don't want to do. Well, I know what it is I want you to do. I know that I want my child to do his homework. I do not want to mobilize a problem-solving process. I just want him to do his homework. I'm very clear about that. He would like to mobilize a problem-solving process, but that is not the issue. You know what you want, you know what the outcome is, and you're trying to figure out how to get others to do it. And as we said, there are multiple ways to do that. You can command and you can shape in various ways. This view, power from the bottom up, is not often about getting people to do a specific thing because you don't know what it is you want them to do. Often what you want is simply to create the process of problem solving that will, depending on the energy and ideas of the people involved, it will get you to an outcome you want in the very broad sense of solving a problem, but the process itself will generate the possible ways of solving that problem and then choose among them. So here, this is where you see these examples of crowdsourcing. So incentive is one, actually more commercial one, where companies put up problems, and then anybody can solve them, and they get paid if they do. Now, the company doesn't know how they're going to be solved. They just know that they want the problem solved. Indeed, this weekend I was at a conference with a very, really terrific scientist from Carnegie Mellon who is actually building this into video games. So as you play video games and you get rewards from getting to the next level, well, he's actually developing technology where you don't just I don't play video games enough to know, but you don't just score whatever you're going to score by shooting down enough people. You actually solve a scientific problem within the video game as a way, again, of bringing crowds, bringing the energy of crowds to work on these issues. Another example is the raw data project that the Guardian newspaper launched. You'll remember when there was the scandal about parliamentarians' expense reports. That actually happened because the Guardian put up the raw data and invited its readers to figure out who was spending what. It got done in about a week. Countless readers, very interested, it's their members of parliament and their tax dollars, combed through the data, put it together in such a way that the Guardian could then publish it. Obviously, they checked it once they'd gone through, but it was bringing people together and letting them do it the way they wanted. Similarly, here on this side of the Atlantic, the Sunlight Foundation wanted to figure out how many members of Congress were spending campaign funds to hire family members. They put up the data and invited people to go through and track each member of Congress, their campaign expenditures, and then go through the data and identify every time it looked like a family member, the same name had been used. And again, it got done in about a week. Okay, so again, thinking about power from the bottom up, starting with individuals and groups in society, thinking about not exercising power over them, but unlocking their power. Unlocking their power in ways that enables them to be creative, to solve problems. It's a different way of thinking about the whole idea of power, a horizontal vision of power. So now let's talk about what the faces of that kind of power were. If we again remember the command, the setting agendas, and shaping preferences. I'd suggest, and here I'm going to put these out there, probably if you hear me talking on this subject in 6 months, it will have evolved, but that's exactly the nature of this process. I'd say instead of command, convene, connect, and catalyze. That is how this kind of power is mobilized. You bring people together, you connect them, so it's not just once. You bring them together and then you connect them electronically in small enough groups so they're actually interacting with one another. And often you start the activity, but you don't know where it's going to go. Instead of constrain, open up. Create as many different ways to plug in as possible. It's the exact opposite of agenda setting. You don't want to constrain choices. You want to open things up as widely as possible and give people ways to plug in. So think about the open government movement, which indeed the president has endorsed it. The idea is you make as much data available as possible. What you're doing is inviting taxpayers in, groups who want to assess things, but you're also inviting in people who can create applications that may be useful. They're looking at everything from air traffic control data to health cost data. They can use that to monitor expenditure, but they can also use that to come up with ways to do that more efficiently and either sell that back to government or use it on its own. But the mantra of this entire community is transparency, openness, but it's openness in two ways. It's making visible what was hidden, and it's allowing people to participate who once were locked out. And finally, instead of shape, share. Now, this is where some people get off the touchy-feely bus, but this is critical. And you've read about this. You've read about the culture of generosity on the internet. You know that the open source movement, the Linux operating systems, is run by people who volunteer their time, just as people volunteered their times on Wikipedia, but on all the projects I just talked about. To mobilize people, instead of shaping preferences and trying to control what people want, you share information, you share experiences, you share connections. Indeed, there's a marvelous book called Share This by a political digital activist who really, the subtitle is Share This, How You Can Change the World. And it's about how you use social media to actually both create your own network, but then to actually be able to mobilize it. So convene, connect, and catalyze, open up, create as many ways to plug in as possible, and share. No matter how we think about power, and I want to emphasize that both worlds coexist. The world that Joe Nye is describing and that he and Bob Cohan originally described in Power and Interdependence, when it's as accurate today as it was when I was sitting where you are over 30 years ago. That world coexists with the world that I'm describing, and you need people in both. And the one thing you absolutely need in both worlds is leadership. It's striking to me as I think about what it means to lead in a world of bottom-up power. I'm increasingly struck that the definition that another of our own, Professor Nan Cohan, came up with in her wonderful book, Thinking About Leadership, she describes leadership as clarifying or defining goals, the goals of a group. So we could sit here and find out what all of you want. We might not get to dinner, but we could do it. And so clarifying and defining goals and then mobilizing energies to achieve those goals. That is a vision of leadership that can work in government, certainly. If you have to, in endless meetings, you have to try to figure out what people want and then to mobilize them. But I put to you, it is a definition of leadership that is particularly appropriate for a world in which it is not just government who leads. It's not just government who takes decisions about how to solve problems, but that all of us have that capability. But the one thing I'm absolutely certain of is however we think about power, however we think about leadership, we will always need the kind of leadership, the kind of marrying power to public purpose, integrity, principle. We will always need the kind of leadership that Joseph Nye has provided us as a scholar, as a public servant, as a public intellectual, and as both a private and a public leader. It is my honor to give the first Nye lecture. Thank you.
So with that closing, I would like to ask Joe Nye if he would like to say a few words, and I think with that picture up there and the last words, it better be nice. That's all I can say. But there are microphones there. Would you like one? Or here. Or you can go up.
Either way. Anne-Marie, thank you very much, and Chris, thank you for hosting this. I must say, as Anne-Marie said, the idea of this lecture came from my involvement in the Robertson case, which was criticizing the Woodrow Wilson School and wanted to take the money away. I thought that was a bad idea. And lo and behold, if you're an expert witness, which I thought I was doing pro bono, you get paid a lot of money. And money that could have been used for scholarships for Woodrow Wilson School students. I said, I don't want the money, I want to give it to the school. And they said, the lawyer said, no, if you do that, you're no longer an impartial witness. So it was a catch-22. So they said, we have to pay you, and then you can donate it to the school. I said, that's very tax inefficient. They said, that doesn't matter. The sums here are much greater than anything about your taxes. So that was the origin of the lecture. It was a sense to pay back the school and to reaffirm the confidence I've had in the school ever since I was an undergraduate and then in the building next door, Corwin Hall. But I wanted to say how much I think that Anne-Marie has contributed in the lecture substantively. This is, it really is extraordinary to think about what the current information revolution has done. Since Moore's law, in which the number of transistors on a chip doubles every 18 months, you had a 1,000-fold decrease in the cost of computing power in the last quarter of the 20th century alone. And that meant that everything became really cheap, and the barriers to participation suddenly vanished, and everybody had information power that previously been rationed by price. And that has given rise to what Anne Marie calls bottom-up power. And we haven't begun to fully cope with it, though the people who have, Anne Marie is at the head of the list. I must say that watching her at a conference such as she's described, we had a conference at the Kennedy School about a week or two ago, and people were talking about how the press was changing under the impact of this new information technology. And on both sides of the screen were these Twitter feeds, and Anne Marie's Twitter feed was always up before I could even think through what had been said. So I use Twitter very occasionally, but the ability to get it up on the screen and have a dialogue, and as she pointed out, it was not merely a conversation of people in the room. These things were being retweeted, and people in India, China, and elsewhere were participating in a conference that was being held with 100 people in the room in Cambridge, Mass., but you would think thousands of people through the links were involved in this conversation. And it really is a very different way of thinking, and it's one which I think, as I mentioned, that we really haven't fully coped with. But I think that the work that Anne Marie is doing in terms of thinking through the impact of this information technology on networks conceived in terms of power conceived in terms of networks is extraordinarily important. And I'm just delighted that, that this is the beginning of a process which I think will lead to an extremely important book. So Anne Marie, thank you very much. If I were to imagine what I would like to be challenged by and hear on the first lecture that I endow, this is it. So thank you.
Thank you.
What?
I thought I was going to get away without questions.
I'm Robert Cohan, and I'm a skeptic. So that was very flattering, Anne Marie. But you know me, I can't sit in a lecture without asking a critical question. In traditional power analysis, there's an assumption that there are differences or conflicts of interest. We don't all have the same interest. And power is defined typically as you did at the outset, as the ability to get others to do what they otherwise wouldn't do. Not to compel them necessarily, maybe do so by changing preferences or agendas, but they wouldn't otherwise do it. And this is traditionally juxtaposed with the old-fashioned kind of liberalism, which E.H. Carr famously condemned and criticized as assuming a harmony of interest among people. And that way, and he devastated that form of liberalism and never came back. Until today.
No, not remotely.
Because it appears to me, and that's why you have to respond to this, that is, that you are assuming a harmony of interest. We are going to convene, comment, and catalyze. We're not going to constrain but enable people. We're going to mobilize people. It sounds like we're assuming that we all have the same interest to solve this problem. And I agree in that case but that's not necessarily the exception of power we normally have. So are you assuming a harmony of interest? And if not, how does your analysis square with conflicts of interest?
Thank you, Bob. Bob and I have had this discussion often. So I'm absolutely not assuming harmony of interest. Harmony of interest is harmony. What I am talking about is mobilizing collaboration and indeed competition in some cases, which does not assume harmony of interest, but it does assume that the clash of interests can result in progress towards solving a problem. So one way to think about it is I come out of law. I come out of the view that the adversary system, structured in various ways under various rules, will involve a tremendous amount of clash of interests, but will nevertheless get us closer to the truth than any other system. And similarly, if you listen to people talk about mobilizing people to solve problems, the scientific process, of course, is all about, well, let's try this, no, that's wrong, no, well, what about this, and what about, and this kind of constant pushing at each other. Indeed, even competition is the notion of striving together to ultimately get to a common goal. Somebody wins, but the whole process is one that advances the goal. So it does assume that the conflict is not so great as to result in violence or to stop playing or to stop participating in the group. That is true. But it says in a community, and indeed any one of the projects I just gave you would be an example, you have lots of people who have competing interests or conflicting interests, but either there's a leader who can mobilize them and structure the process in such a way that that is constructive, or the process is sufficiently open that they compete with each other, but ultimately we get the problem solved. So it doesn't for a minute assume harmony. Harmony would not be collaboration. Harmony would just be everybody agreeing on what they want. Collaboration and competition, they're actually, I think, very closely aligned, assume a striving and a colliding, but in a constructive way.
So we now have, unless we can continue this later, but
We will.
But we have two microphones here. People who want to ask questions are free to come down. We usually like to invite students to come down first. So Marion, great.
Thanks, Professor Slaughter. I have two questions. One is about the interaction between bottom-up power and top-down power. The other is about policy implications. In Iran in 2009 in the summer, people exercised a lot of bottom-up power, but they were still slayed in the streets and the same regime stayed. So what's your theory for if you had top-down power as something with a positive coefficient minus bottom-up power? What is the net outcome, and when does bottom-up power become powerful enough to overcome top-down power so that the people on the bottom can get what they want? And the second question on policy implications is, a lot of the examples you listed are about non-governmental actors filling in a space where there's an absence of governance. For example, the Palestinian Political Risk Group, or they're non-governmental actors who are empowered by the government providing a good rule of law foundation. For example, The Guardian posting data on parliamentary expenses. It would only be able to do that in a society with a free press protected by law. So would your policy proposals be to focus on all these things about opening the space for social media, providing a forum for conversation, or is the policy implication to strengthen government, a democratic government, and a government based on rule of law?
Thank you. So there's no question, and it's implied in my answer to Bob's question, that force is still force, and both models coexist, and there is certainly a point at which force can shut everything else down. I think it is much harder to do that than most governments assume. The Iranian government appears to have done it for now. I think a lot of that is still simmering under the surface, and we will see it again. The Burmese government certainly managed to shut down the monks as well. On the other hand, they are gradually now creating more space, and there's still a very vibrant movement ready, I think, that has maintained even under the blanket of force. In Syria, we're seeing something very different. We're seeing people who are taking the same kind of brutality that we saw in Iran, who are simply not giving up. and who are, in fact, the more they are killed, the more determined they seem to be to continue. So I would suggest, even in that situation, I can't tell you how much force is required. I mean, the Syrian government could certainly use a lot more, but they're doing their best in terms of actually trying to isolate individual groups of protesters and killing individuals as often as they can. But your overall point is a good one, that there's nothing in bottom-up power that assumes that force can't shut it down. It does assume that the more people are connected and the more they can essentially, like any network, if they're hit in one place, they can reconvene in another. They're much stronger against centralized power. But again, there's a point at which, if you're willing to be ruthless enough, you can shut it down. In terms of policy implications, I think that's one of the most interesting questions. There's some that are very clear and they're already happening, and I did a lot of this in the State Department, and Secretary Clinton came into the State Department determined to do this, which was to create public-private partnerships. Even beyond public-private partnerships, one of Joe Nye's colleagues at the Kennedy School, Jane Nelson, writes about collaborative networks. So they're broader than just a couple corporations and some NGOs and universities and government. They're really, they can have hundreds of different participants, again, broadly collaborating in different ways. And I was just at an ideas forum in Washington where every single government official who got up there were about 8 of them, all talked about public-private partnerships for the not surprising reason that they're all facing budget cuts. And in that context, they want to be able to work with social actors. One of the first things a corporation will tell you, or an NGO, is, well, that better not mean we pay and you direct, and that better not mean that you direct and we monitor. We have to be equal partners. So it's actually, again, it immediately introduces this uncertainty of outcome, because if you're really going to enter a partnership with a corporation and an NGO, they're going to have their own views about how to do it, and you may well not get what you originally thought you were going to get. I think the more interesting policy implications, and I'm just at the outset of this, are to what extent is it possible for government being used as a platform? And this, again, is something that Raj Shah, the head of USAID, talks about USAID as a platform for convening and connecting the many different actors in the development community, from CARE to the Gates Foundation to countless much smaller groups. But can you use government as a platform to help create the conditions for self-organization? Because the most powerful power from the bottom up, as you see in social media, is not about anybody designing it. It is about the process itself, the process of complex systems where people self-organize. Obviously, we see this in a market, where it's sustainable because you're not having to design it and you're not having to monitor it. And the question that I am asking is, do we know enough about complex systems and self-organization that we can create conditions in which, to take a concrete example, if you are working on a development problem in a particular country and you're working on health clinics or schools, you can create the conditions by which there is a dynamic and ongoing process of those communities organizing themselves and doing what they want, where you're facilitating it, but you're really not doing much more than that. I don't know the answer. That may be utopian, but there's certainly a lot of interesting theory out there that suggests maybe we could. Yeah.
Is the Occupy Wall Street an example that you're hinting at?
It is. Indeed,
Develop.
Well, what's most interesting about Occupy Wall Street is the number of similar groups. There are 80 cities, and of course now it's actually all over the world, but within the first week, or the first 2 weeks, if you were watching it, you could go on the Meetup site, which is a technology that allows people to meet up on everything from cooking to a shared love of boats to politics. I mean, it's a technology that allows you to join very, very effectively. You could see it, you could literally see it spreading. So first it was the big cities, and then it was smaller towns, and you could see people going on the same website, copying from each other, and joining. You know, What's interesting is, though, and we're seeing this now, it's not like in the Middle East. They don't want to overthrow the government. One of the powers, fortunately, from my point of view, I mean, whatever your politics, I'm not interested in overthrowing the government. But if you talk to Egyptians about what was happening in Egypt, one of the things they'll tell you is they were able to take all these different groups, from soccer clubs to unions to professors' groups, all these different groups, and focus them on one common goal. And that's what gave the self-organization its power and its momentum. Here, precisely because of the philosophy they're taking, which is self-organization to a fault, it's very hard to see that momentum developing. So either I would suggest a political movement, either the unions or the Democratic Party or some more established political movement, actually kind of organizes them, as in part happened with the Tea Party, or they may be there as a kind of prick to conscience, maybe more than a prick, but not an actual social movement that is going to turn into a set of goals.
Hi, thanks for your lecture. I'm wondering why you focus so much on the individuals and groups who use these technologies that you're talking about, and not the firms, the private actors that own the technologies.
Well, I mean, there are many different ways to slice looking at the tech world, and there are, of course, many people who are interested in how you use technology to improve governance, and then there are many people who are interested in how you use governance of, how we get real governance of technology, and certainly, I mean, whether it's thinking about servers ultimately in private hands, or thinking about how, say, with WikiLeaks, government was able to put pressure on private firms to take action that many people might have thought was contrary to freedom of speech. There are a whole set of very important questions about regulating these actors. I think those are very important. I'm not, I mean, there are other people studying that. What I am interested in is how, as somebody who's interested in foreign policy and global problems, how you can use the technology to harness the energy or to unlock the energy and the creativity and the individual agency of many, many individuals who never could participate before. So that's just the angle that I'm coming at it with, but there are extremely important questions with respect to the nature of who runs the technology. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So jumping back to a question that was asked earlier about, or not a question, a comment rather made about the fact that we're presuming that the governments in question allow for a free press. I guess today it was announced, or not announced, but a newspaper report came out saying that the word occupy is now being censored by Google in China.
I'm sorry, what is being censored?
Oh, the word occupy in Google searches in China is now being censored because of the Occupy movements going on in the US. So I was wondering, can bottom-up power still exist in societies where free press is not a given, and if so, how?
Well, China is actually a great example because most young people in China do get their news, or at least I've heard young people say this, I have not verified it, but from microblogs, so from the equivalent of Twitter. Weibo is the one they use the most frequently, and there are a number of them, and I've had Chinese explain to me that the government can't censor them all at once. So they're very good at getting news out on different ones. One, the sort of one will go down, where you're searching and the words suddenly, I've had that happen in China where you get told, no, the search won't work, but another is still working. So my sense is that although the Chinese government has 3 million people involved in censoring their internet, and they're very effective, but they, look, they're up against 1 billion people, and they are, many of these people, precisely because it's handheld, are very adept at getting around it. The other thing I would just say is our own students, when they go to Beijing or Shanghai, report that it takes about 3 minutes to get around the Twitter, Facebook firewall and to then get on it, although I think that's probably for elites. That's probably not people with cell phones in other cities.
You tended to focus a lot on the positive aspects of lowering the barriers to entry for regular citizens to get involved. What are some of the nefarious ways that this new movement can cause, whether by government or non-state actors, or the fact that a lot of times computer viruses can be spread so easily? What are some of the more nefarious aspects of this?
Well, the most evident one is, anything that empowers a positive movement empowers a criminal movement. So it's very striking that just recently this newspaper editor in Mexico dared blog about mouse so full that actually citizens feeling empowered enough to start identifying where killings are happening and to write about the violence is the first step in mobilizing society, social opinion. But the more direct point is just that, how are they communicating with all the different members of the drug cartel? Or how does Al-Qaeda communicate with many of its recruits? I remember sitting, Joe and I both sat and watched websites used by various terrorist groups and how they are used and how they push out propaganda. So any of this could be equally used for nefarious purposes of any kind. I guess, if you think that human nature, there's always a balance between people who want to use things for positive purposes and people who don't. I think there is more opportunity now for many, 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 many people who actually do want to be a part of something more positive and who feel completely disempowered or maybe empowered only by criminal alternatives to be a part of actually building their society and monitoring their government. So I focus on that part because I'm focusing on how you actually solve problems as a foreign policy maker. But the first thing I would say, even right now, looking at the Middle East, what you're seeing are governments, and informants using the very same technologies that the protesters are using, and it's a question of who's staying just a little ahead of whom. Mike.
Thank you once again for a great talk. I was wondering if we go to a real situation like in Egypt or whatever, where, whether you agree with it or not, there might have been a social media component
Absolutely.
to what happened. Is it possible, though, that on the big question of toppling power or electing Barack Obama, whatever that, social media works, but it can actually lead to some fragmentation thereafter? By which I mean, since there are no barriers to entry and everybody gets to have their own individual voice, and there isn't institutions per se, that it's harder then for them to coalesce and really form, in this Egypt, in the case of Egypt, maybe a government, what have you. Could you please comment?
Yep. Well, so the first thing is I think there's no more reason, sadly, to think that what's happened in Egypt or what's happened in Tunisia or what's happened in Libya is going to produce the kinds of government we and I believe the populations, many of people in the populations of those countries would like to see than it was for the French Revolution or the revolutions of 1848 or, fortunately, our own revolution we managed to get through without a huge counter-revolution, but we had we went through the world's worst, bloodiest war before we actually got to the government we have today. So there's nothing about social media that says those dynamics are not going to happen. And indeed, it's quite possible, this goes back to, a strong man who is willing to be brutal enough and enough ordinary citizens who are tired of the constant destabilization. One of the things I would say is that I think the generation that's living with these technologies are much more comfortable with constant change and disruption than many people are, but they're not going to necessarily determine everything. So I think it could be very unpleasant. And in that sense, I would say that this is something Nan and I have talked about. You still do need leadership. I have been persuaded. You may not need leadership in the same way in toppling these governments, but you absolutely need leadership of some kind in mobilizing positive and constructive energy. I do not think you can just leave this and have it somehow be magically constructive because of the technology. That said, and this is where probably my last word, I do think that because of the technology, it is possible for more people to participate. And there is evidence that more people participating can actually moderate extremes and can actually contribute to a sort of stabilizing influence. But this is cutting-edge research that actually people at Princeton are doing about what happens when you add sort of uninformed people to groups that have very strong extremes with them. I still think the ability to publicize brutality, the ability to connect to people outside the country, gives people who want positive change a better chance than they might have had. But as I said, the revolutions of human history would not lead us to think that this is going to be an easy road. Sad and somber note.
I want to thank Anne-Marie for a wonderful lecture and thank Joe Nye for making it possible. Thanks. Good evening.
No problem. I could have done it. I could have sort of talked through the pictures,
Yeah.
but you could see I had some things to...
I'll let you get mobbed for 5
Okay.
minutes, then we'll haul you
Yeah,
off for
that'd be
dinner.
great.
Yeah?
What is... what?